little bit of a rant. I'm going on a little bit of a rant today. This is something that I've seen, and I'm seeing it more and more, and it's very troubling to me. It's about using the language imprecisely and causing yourself and others problems because we're being vague and general when we need to be specific. I'm specifically talking about using the word podcast when you mean episode of the podcast, right? I'm seeing it over and over again. I ask a question, people are talking about, well, I'm going to charge this much per podcast for their advertising or for sponsorship. That is a problem. A podcast is the overall production of the show from episode 0 to the ending final episode. It's like calling a series a show, right? If you in the television context, there are episodes of podcasts. Each time you put out a new recording, that's an episode. That's not a podcast. A podcast is the assembly of all of the episodes, the sequence, the series, the aggregation of them all. And when you talk in terms of getting sponsors for your podcast, you should be thinking about sponsoring all of the episodes, right? But if you're going to charge them on a per episode basis, don't say, I'm going to charge you $50 per podcast. I've seen this as a lawyer. I'm helping clients dealing with this stuff. I had a client who made a deal with a sponsor. It was a good deal. It was going to be $1,000 per episode. This particular show has a good reach, and they were able to charge $1,000 per podcast. That's what the contract. They wrote a contract, and it said $1,000 per podcast. So a year goes by. Podcaster is hitting the credit card provided by the sponsor every week for $1,000. $52,000 later, sponsor comes back looking at their finances. Hey, you overcharged us. Give us $51,000 back. We said we'd pay $1,000 for the podcast, which was the title of the show. Now, I think both sides knew what they meant, but because of this use of imprecise language, the podcast ends up having to refund 51 of the 52 weeks worth of fees that, of course, had been spent on operating the show and paying salaries and those kinds of things. So sponsor comes along and says, hey, wait a minute, I was sponsoring the podcast. That meant one payment for the year, one payment for the show, for the series. And the podcaster, of course, thought that it was going to be one payment for each episode. Now, no meeting of the minds, maybe there was no contract, but now the podcasters performed. Those ads have been in every single episode. And so we end up having to do a settlement between the parties. And that means now paying lawyers. This is simple stuff to avoid. Be precise. Use precise language when you're entering into arrangements for your episodes. Hey, by the way, if you're watching live, I'd love to have your comments. So say hello. Let me know who's here watching. And if you have questions or observations about this, let's talk. This is happening more and more. Just today, I've seen 3 different Facebook posts where somebody was talking about podcasts when they meant podcast episodes. And this is a problem. It's a problem that I'm seeing in the live stream community as well. People are making episodes of a show, right? Now, when you say, when you're doing YouTube video, you say per video, right? Not per channel, right? There you go. Jennifer, nice to see you. You can't stay. Well, okay, thank you. I'm glad you say it's good info. I'm glad I was able to help with that. Yeah, you got to be focused and specific about these things so that there can be no misunderstandings. The purpose of contract, when you ask why do we even have a law of contracts, why do we bother with contracts? It's to allow us to have a robust economy that relies on, to a certain extent, credit, but also, just the ability to have confidence in outcomes. And so when you make a contract, the goal, the purpose of making the contract is to allow an outside observer to know whether the parties did what they were supposed to do or not, whether the contract has been performed or not, whether the payment has happened properly or not, and what's the right amount, those kinds of things. If you don't use precise language, then you don't have a useful contract. You may still have a binding agreement, but then you end up asking a judge or a jury to decide what you meant. Well, you knew what you meant when you're going in. And the purpose of having contracts, the purpose of negotiating contracts, is making sure that the parties are on the same page. What we lawyers in law school classes talking about contracts, we talk about the meeting of the minds. If there's no meeting of the minds, then it's not really a contract. Contract is another word for agreement. So if you can't have an agreement without everybody understanding the things the same way, and when you have terms like episode or podcast and you use the wrong one or you use generalities, you create these big gaps of vague, ambiguous terminology. And that is bad for everybody, right? Don't think that, well, if I leave it ambiguous, I can wiggle later. I can wiggle out later. You don't need to do that. Just be specific about what you want. And if you can't come to the agreement now before the contract, you're never going to come to an agreement later after someone's put themselves out, done the things that they need to do in reliance on this contract, and then come and do arm twisting and so on. That leads to sour feelings and bad outcomes. So don't use imprecise language. Be as specific and precise as possible when you make deals. Now, contracts, we make them all the time, even when we don't have them in formal written, legalese. There are contracts all the time. When you do an email saying, hey, I'll give you a 30-second ad spot in my podcast episode for $100 per episode. You've just made an offer. If the other side says, sounds great, where do I pay? Hey, guess what? You've got a contract. It's got all the elements of what a contract needs to be: an offer, an acceptance, a consideration, and a lawful purpose, and the parties presumably have capacity to enter into contract and so on. So those are the elements of a contract. But if you don't have the precise language, if you don't have specific terms, then you can't really arrive at an agreement, at a meeting of the minds, and that's the problem. So that's it for today. I'm going to just sign off with the end of this rant. It's just something that popped into my mind, and I felt like, wow, I got to get out there and help people make sure they're making good contracts and smart deals. So thanks for watching. I'll see you again really soon. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer. Talk to you again later. Bye.